Let's be honest. And I recognize that. So I'm not going to do too much input. I'm going to be thinking about what's the role of the leader. And at the end, just to really keep you awake, I'm going to make some suggestions for you as a synod. Throw a bit of controversy in, which will just kind of snap you back into, awakeness. But what I'd like you to do now is just turn to the person around you and say, what's the one thing that has most kind of struck you from what you've heard this morning? So what's personally for you, what's the thing that's really said something to your heart this morning? And then after that, when you've done that, we're going to have a chance, because I haven't really given you a chance to have much feedback to me. If you want to ask questions, or maybe you want to make a comment, or you've got something really helpful to add to the things we've been talking about, then it would be great to hear from you, because I think this is about mutual learning. So I'm going to give you 3 or 4 minutes just to talk with each other about what's the thing that's really struck you. But then I'm going to throw the mic open and just to hear what questions you might have, comments, or insights from your own situation. So let's start by talking together about what struck you most, and then I'll come back in 4 or 5 minutes and we'll talk together. To hear from you now using the mics, but if there may be questions you have, you think, well, that's all okay, but, or it might be, as I said, you've got insights from your own situation which would be really helpful, or it may be you've just got some comments you want to make, because this isn't just about me, it's about all of us learning together. So I hope we're not just going to have a time of silence now, but we might. So we need 1 or 2 brave people to get it going, because that's what we find, like Ruth Mary.
Something that we talked about at our table, but also over lunch, which I found really wonderful, Dave, was the thing that you gave us that said that we are to love, then relate, and then create, and how we've been doing it the opposite way round. And the permission that gives for us not to have to rush stuff to get it together, but to relax in God's timing and that God's at work. So that was one of the key things. I remember we talked about that before, but I've been going back to default mode of create rather than loving and relating and letting God show us what to create out of that. So I've had a couple of conversations over lunch, and that was one of the key things that really was highlighted through that. So
thank you. And we were talking a bit about this yesterday with some other ministers, and one minister I think was helpfully saying that it's actually quite a hard thing to do as a minister, because we're less in control at that point than we are when we start with the creating. And I think one of the pressures can be the kind of church council saying, well, what are we doing? And so we do something because we feel we've got it, then we can put it on a sheet, we've done this. When actually, I think there's a real need to love and to listen to God and to our community and to discern what the Spirit is saying. And that importance of prayer and all that, I think, is really important. Yeah, thank you for that. Other questions, comments, thoughts?
So Dave, we really appreciated what you had to say about the notion of prioritising, being out with a rugby team on a Sunday morning and those sorts of things. That comes into conflict, particularly for me, but for others as well, to some extent, with the value that we have of worship and, what is our joy and responsibility to actually meet together to worship. And for me, I also move in circles that, worship the Lord in the beauty of holiness is kind of the value. And that kind of dictates a number of things that do constrict us. Yep.
No, thank you for that. That's a really important thing. I hasten to add, I'm not saying we shouldn't be worshipping. We could actually have a long debate what that even means in terms of worship. The whole Romans 12's one thing, which is your spiritual worship, which is your offering of yourselves. But it is this priority of who is the church for, or who is the mission for? which then might say, we will need to do worship at a different time, which wouldn't be our preference. But if the key thing is, who is the mission for, is the first question before who is this the church for, then that might mean us emptying ourselves. Now, as I said, I think worship has got to be there for us, and we, in the New Testament, you see these two things of gathering and scattering are the two movements. And it's recognizing that the whole point of us coming together is to be sent out in service. One of the ways I often explain it, because of my sporting analogy, is that our worship is the half-time team talk. It's not the game. The game is what happens when we leave the building. We come together, in a sense, for that half-time team talk. And we're prepared and sent out again into God's world. So, it partly depends on the context of where you are, but I just think for so many people, as was said before, Sunday is either the day they stay in bed or it's the kids' sports days, and it's at this point we're not going to be able to say to them, you must give that all up to come on a Sunday. We need to connect where they are at first before we can do anything else. We do need, I think, in our society to highlight the importance of the Sabbath, the day of rest. I think it's a real danger in our society, but that's not the place I would start in terms of needing a day of rest or all those kind of things. I think we've got to start where the people are at and how we connect with them, and then what that means for our own worship. And so it's about where are the priorities in this that I think that then make that really, really important. And it's that recognition we're not going back to a golden time. Actually, God is calling us ever into an increasing change. So I think those would be the kind of things I would say. I don't know if you want to come back to me on any of that, Vicky.
I hear all that, and that's fantastic. But is mission in the end the priority, or is God? And certainly God is everywhere and to be worshipped at every time. But where is there a line to say, well, in fact, we Christians have always met together and broken bread on, the first day of the week, and this is somehow a significant thing as well.
Yep. The interesting thing, obviously, is that Christians haven't always met on that this wouldn't be a new thing. Even the early church didn't always meet on the first day because of the other things that they would be involved in. So I think that pattern is not something that we can have to say that's always there. I think, as you said, that first day of the week, there is something special about that because it's about remembering Jesus' resurrection. So for me, that's about the heart of the tradition, and then how that works out in the practice of our society at the moment is, I think, is starting then from where people are at. You may well then, over time, those people who are becoming disciples may change in their approach to how they see Sundays, but I just don't think we can necessarily start there. Or it may be that we say, actually the time to meet, and I know a number of places do that, is Sunday afternoon. Sunday morning's the worst time for people. So let's do Sunday at 5, or Sunday at 7. But let's just have that flexibility to say, when is the time that we might better connect with people as a kind of priority? And I do think that, at the heart of God is He is a God of mission. And that He calls us, the missionary step is not a second step. God didn't create the world and then think, oh, mission would be a good thing. That was right at the heart of all that He's doing. So I think there is a tension there. But I said, I think in the end, there is something about us being willing to empty ourselves in that, to put others first so that they might connect with God. And then we may well see things change and, Sundays coming back, whatever. But we need to start where those people are at, I think. And again, it's about context. I said I probably wouldn't start with public worship. Well, in Huddersfield, we planted a church for people in their 70s and 80s. Well, the obvious place to start with that is public worship, singing a traditional hymns. That's what we did. So it is also all contextual in terms of how you begin those connections. Yeah, thank you for that. That's a really important question, I think, for us to continue teasing out. Sharon.
Hi, Dave. I'm just wondering if you might comment on who the we is that we're talking about, because I hear echoes of being in and being out, and that mission is out, and that gathering and worship is in. And my question is related to my experience, I guess, that when I worship, I'm very conscious that I'm worshipping with broken people, and that it seems to be a mistake if we think that when we gather the whole people together, and then the whole people go out. And I wonder if you'd like to comment about that.
Would you just explain a bit more what you mean by the whole in that sense?
Well, I get the sense that we talk about ourselves as the redeemed.
Okay.
Who are then on mission out to the unredeemed.
Yep.
And that troubles me.
Yep. Well, I think my answer to that would be that the we is always all of us, but the sense of we've got it right and everyone else has got it wrong is not what we're about. And I think that was I was trying to say with those words from 1 Corinthians. It's actually going out in weakness to what seems the powers that I think is the way that we're called. And I don't think the New Testament has this kind of them and us analogy. It has this sense, as we said at the beginning, that it is about love and generosity, and that we are called to take this generous gift that we've received to others. So I think it's a sense of, there used to be that classic thing, one beggar showing another beggar where there's bread. And it's that kind of image that I think is what this is about. It's about us recognizing we're not doing this because we are now better than anyone. It is actually all that it is that this is that Philip, my guy from the Botanical Garden, that this is now so coming out of us that this thing happens, and we begin to see other people where this thing happens. And I mean, the other thing is that the church is always a mess, isn't it, of people who are in different stages in that journey. And one of the things when we planted the net we want to ask is, how could we encourage people to stay, that they consider they were part of this, even though they were still at the beginning stage of that journey, and even in their own self-description wouldn't call themselves Christians. And I think that's a really good question to ask. And we worked really hard, and we had people who journeyed with us for 2-3 years as part of that process, who would self-describe themselves as not Christians, but would describe themselves as part of the church. So there's always that messiness in that. I think that is really important to actually keep. And I think, as I said, one of the signs is people who are journeying with us in that process, and we're seeing lives transformed, but it's taking time, and they're accepted and loved and part of this, I think is really important. So yeah, thank you for that. Yeah.
In that last slide you put up where for 20 minutes you wanted us to have a bit of a chat.
Yes.
It seemed to be in a process order. That is, that we'd find out what structures are out which weren't any good, then we look at what needed to be changed. The view on our table was that the first thing that needed to be changed was an attitude. So therefore, the order was in the wrong, the structure was in the wrong order. People had to be in a space where they were committed to and trusted in the whole idea of mission and evangelism being central to their faith and activity rather than something that came afterwards. Yeah,
thank you. No, that was probably the way I put the question. I apologise about that. I totally agree. Totally agree. Thank you for sharing that. I appreciate that. I would completely agree with that.
Sorry to be a small person. Dave, I've really appreciated pretty much all that you've said, because it has helped to me to think about what we're doing in the church that I belong to, and where it might go. When you're talking about the we and the us and going out and who is it for and whatever, I worship at a central city church surrounded by office buildings that close down at 5 o'clock or thereabouts at night and are not open at the weekend. So to think about how we engage in mission to the people who work all around us in government offices, in the city council right in our lane, which we own, to the 1,400 people who walk up and down it every day as they go to the law courts and various other places, is what we see as our context. And it's a midweek during the day mostly for those people. And so what we've come to the conclusion, and we may be wrong, is that we have to go outside the church, and they're not going to come inside our church during the week. Some people will, but and we open it for those people who want to come and just meditate or whatever. But we do things out in the lane and in the front of the church, right on the street front or in our back plaza patio area. And as an example, we have music in the lane every Monday lunchtime to help people who are a bit harried by having a busy work day, to say, I'll just go and eat my lunch and listen to some good music and take a break away from the desk. Is that mission? Is that ministering? One of our ministers has just put a proposal that on a Tuesday she'll do what she's calling pop-up office. She'll go out and sit in the lane beside the church at a folding table and a chair, and she might have some signs around it or whatever, and she'll just work and do the work she would do in her shut-up office otherwise, and just see who might want to come and talk. So these are the kinds of things we're saying, what do we do? Now, this is all part of us as Pilgrim. We worship together on a Sunday and we do all this other stuff during the week, and we support all the other individuals who get involved in solidarity and justice activities with the disadvantaged and marginalised. Is this fresh expressions? We think it is, but fresh expressions always sounds like you're going to start something somewhere else and it'll end up with some kind of a worship activity for those people which grows out of who they are. We haven't even got that far yet. We're just trying to make connections and be hospitable. Comments?
Brilliant. No, I think it's great, and you highlight a lot of the things we've been talking about, so it just sounds great. I think that with a lot of these things, it might end up with a worshipping community, but you don't know, and it's going to take time. I was talking to someone earlier who said, we started 4 things, and we realised we couldn't manage all of them, so we're doing 2 of them. And the thing we've discovered from the UK is you try lots of things, and some of it will kind of really grow and develop, and some of it will be great for a time, but won't be there forever. I think that's one of the things we struggle with our traditions, is that, church has been here for a long time, and whatever we do, we've got to keep doing. And I think with these things, there's a lot more experimentation going on. And some of those things will be what they are now, but other things will lead on to other things through those relationships. And I think that's one of the exciting things of seeing what God is doing and kind of trying to then follow that up. As I said, like these mums who just started by praying together for the school, but that led to them doing something in the school, which has led to them to doing a kind of family church on a Saturday. That wasn't how they ever envisaged them. And some of these things will just stay as community activities. But it's just, I think it's just trying it and doing it. I'd really say well done on all that. And you've really thought about your context and how you connect with people. And pray like anything and just see where God leads you in that. I think is really important. The other thing I think I would say is, if you've got people who are in those offices, ask them to think about how they could do that within those environments as well. That's the other thing. Don't just think about it from a kind of church or in a neutral space, but how might they become visible witnesses by serving their local community? So, for instance, I know of a big water company in the UK where a group of 5 or 6 Christians got together and started a parenting course because they recognised that was a real need amongst the people in their company, from which a Christian community has begun to form, again, from the relationships that have started. So it is amazing the places you can start, and you never quite know what the journey is that God might take you on. Yeah, thank you. That was brilliant. Keep going, definitely. Yeah.
Dave, you asked us a question about what was the most effective discipleship training we'd done in our congregation, in our lives.
Yeah.
And I was curious, 2 things. One is, what would be your answer? And is it different in Fresh Expressions churches than it is in traditional churches? What, the effective discipleship programs, or no, not even programs, practices? Yes,
I think for me, partly because I'm an extrovert, the most effective discipleship process is meeting with 1 or 2 or 3 other people and sharing my life with them. That, for me, is making myself accountable and being open to questions and journeying together and being honest about where I am. As I said, I meet with these other people, but I also meet individually with some other people. That, for me, is the best practice. I think that in Fresh Expressions it's no different, except that I think we're trying to ask some of the... I don't think we know all the answers to this, but we're really trying to ask the questions for people who may well be coming into the church with no Christian background. What is it we're trying to do with them? And what are the processes that might help in that? And I think one of the best ways is thinking about, well, what are the ways that we are nurtured in our own Christian lives, and how can we put those in? And as I said, I think it's helping people to see it's a communal thing. You can't do this on your own. I think it's helping people see that it's a reflective practice. So you're always asking, what is it that God is teaching me through these experiences of life? And I think it's that reminder that this is about a person in the end, not a set of practices. Ultimately, that the practices help us to do that. And then the ways we work that out will look very different depending on the culture and the context and stuff. And I think I'm really keen to get away from just thinking about the kind of socialization things that we often have in our discipleship programs. But I'd say in the UK, we're not really sure. So if you know those things, I would love to know them more, because I think it's something we're really grappling with. And I feel we're kind of beginning to understand what the questions are behind that. But as I go around, I'm not seeing many answers to that. Yeah, thank you for that. It's a really important thing. Great. Well, I just want to speak a little bit now about, just for 10, 20 minutes, about what I call finding your voice. Particularly for those of you who are leaders in any way, and you're all leaders here, ordained and lay. And really this question of, and I often get asked this, well, I'm not an evangelist, so how do I get involved in this? How do I lead in evangelism? Because all the research would say that the role of the leaders in setting the tone for this is really key. But if this isn't my natural giftings, what on earth do I do? And I'm always encouraged by these words that Paul wrote to Timothy. He said, as for you, always be sober, endure suffering, do the work of an evangelist, carry out your ministry fully. And that phrase, do the work of an evangelist, literally means shape yourself or form yourself into an evangelist. So the idea behind it is he's really saying to Timothy, I know this isn't you, but you've got to kind of create yourself into this role to carry out your ministry fully. And if you think about Ephesians 4, where it says, where evangelist is named as one of the gifts of the church, the whole point of being an evangelist is not to do evangelism, but to prepare the people of God to serve. So the role of an evangelist is to prepare other people for evangelism. And Paul is saying to Timothy, you've got to, as the leader, one of the leaders here, you've got to form yourself into a position where you are able to equip and inform and encourage others to be involved in this. And so I think if you're there thinking, well, this isn't really me, then these are the key things, I think, which you need to think about. The first as leaders is, how are we envisioning our communities to be caught up in God's big story? As I said, with the net, it was very much saying, look, we've seen these statistics that say 53% of people have no contact with any religious institution. Those are the people that God is calling us to connect with. And that was our vision. In fact, we had it as a kind of vision statement. We seek to enable unchurched people to develop a real and relevant relationship with Jesus. And we had a bit of a train crash, if I'm honest, after the first year, where I thought we'd worked on this together, we all know what's happening. And then I realized that half the people had forgotten that that's why we were doing what we were doing. And I discovered some stuff from the business world where they'd pinched a bit out the Old Testament. They call it the Nehemiah principle, which says that unless you restate a vision every 28 days, it gets lost. That is frightening, isn't it? And I found that to my cost. So I started to think, how every 28 days can I remind us why we're here? So I had to find creative ways to do that. So at the beginning of the year, I would do something about that. At the beginning of the school year, at our annual general meeting, in different ways. It was the same message, remember why we're here, for the 53%. But I just found creative ways of doing it. And amazingly, they never realized I was telling them the same thing all the time. And every time, say, we got together the children's teachers, I would start off by saying, now remember why we're doing this. Because we're here, because we want to connect with those 53%. Or when I met with the pastoral people, or whoever it might be, we just kept reminding ourselves, this is why we're doing it. And I think that's really at the core of this. And one of the great things, actually, I learned from my Methodist heritage, there were many, but was I used to remember our church, little Methodist chapel, we had a church anniversary. And so I just went back to the heart of the tradition, reinterpreted it as our birthday, because we were new. So we had a first, second, third, and the church is still going today. And at that birthday, we celebrated that we were a year old. And people came up the front to tell their stories about how God was transforming their lives. And that was one of the best ways of envisioning people, when you start to see what's happening. And you start to see how all your lives are being transformed by this adventure that you are on. So what are the creative ways in which you can envision? And it's interesting, I was just down in Perth, or south of Perth, working with a church, helping them to think about, they wanted some kind of vision statement. And I discovered that they'd had a vision statement about 5 years before. And when I asked them what it was, no one could remember. And that's the whole point about envisioning. Actually getting some kind of vision or vision statement or story, or however you put it, is not the important thing. I know millions of churches that have got great vision statements which are now on their shelves. It's the envisioning day by day that is the key. It's not getting it, it's keeping it. That I think is one of the key roles of leaders, if not the key role in this. So it's envisioning. And if you do that well, you end up with kind of a clarity about what you're about. The previous church I was at had no clarity at what it was about. So it had basically 150 vision statements written by every individual. So everyone thought everything was great, but we never did anything. And it leads you to some sense of movement and process as well. Well, how will this work out? And as people come to faith, how do they grow? And how do we grow? And where's the training? It allows you to align things as well. So you start to say, one of the great things we said was, this isn't just for those who are adults, this is for our children and our young people as well. So how do we align all that together? made us think about the way that we did our teaching and our preparation for all ages. How are we making sure that this vision is working through out everything that we're doing? And it gives you a huge focus then for what you're doing. The second thing we need, I think, as well as envisioning, is to encourage people. We used to have a phrase, minimize meetings and maximize relationships. Because if all the time we're wanting people to be in church, how are they loving and relating and creating? How do we encourage people to be the missionaries they're meant to be? I think one of the great ways is taking people to things that are happening and show them what's happening. It may be other local things that are happening. Take them to those things, and it allows their imagination to be fired, not to go away and say, oh, we're going to copy what this church is doing, but they think, oh, wow, that could be, if it's possible there, we could do that, or we could do something like that, or we could do this. One of the most amazing things we ever did is we linked up with a church in Taiwan, and we took 10 of the people from Huddersfield to work with this church in Taiwan. Imagine you've only been a Christian a few weeks, and suddenly you're working with a church in Taiwan. Wow, what a way to be encouraged in God's mission. That this is a much bigger church than you ever imagined that you were joining. How do we encourage people in this? To think about it, to pray, to read, to be involved. Really, really important to think about that. 30 is the need to equip people. There was a UK evangelist that I was talking to who had said he'd worked with, I think it was 1,017 churches. And I'm supposing that those were quite, keen churches if they got this guy in to do evangelism with them. And he wrote back to them to find out how many of those 1,017 had done any training in evangelism for their people. And he discovered out of those 1,017, 36 churches had done some kind of training. And it was interesting, I found from NCLS that training in the last 2 years, the lowest denomination in terms of training in evangelism is the Uniting Church. 5% of church is actually higher than the proportion in the UK. But it's worth thinking, we can't just say to people, right, get out there and share your story. How are we equipping them to do that? I think is really important. And I would say to those of you who are leaders, there is a difference between training and telling. We can stand at the front and tell them for Sunday after Sunday after Sunday, but unless we are training them to do it, it's really hard for them. I know there's I think you heard about it yesterday, but a conference coming up which is all about training and equipping for evangelism. There's things like the Mission Shape Ministry course, but there are lots of other resources out there which help you to do this. And it's worth thinking about how are we equipping people to do this. And what are we equipping them to do? One of the conversations we had in Huddersfield is, what are we actually asking people to do then? Are we asking people to go on the streets or knock on doors or lead the first person that they see and say, do you want to kneel here and pray a prayer? And we talked with the whole church about this, and we said, what would be a right expectation for what we could all do, regardless of our gifts? And we decided that together there were 3 things we could do. The first is we could all pray. And pray specifically for our friends, our neighbors, our workmates, our community, and to pray intentionally and old style, but we kind of created a bookmark for people to write names down, because it's amazing. A, it reminds you this is God's work, and B, it keeps those things at the top of your head. So everyone said, yeah, even if we've only been a Christian a few weeks, we could do that, we can pray. Secondly, we said, we really feel everyone should better share their story. Not necessarily better defend the faith or tell all the biblical truths or defend all the doctrines, but share our own story of what this is meaning for us now, as well as our conversion story or whatever, our growth story. And again, we found some resources and people that wanted some training in that. We provided that training. And again, there's lots of resources out there. And the third thing that we said to people was, we all agreed, was I could invite people to things that happen either in the church or elsewhere. And there needs to be a bit of a contract with that, I think, as well, that the things you're asking people to invite are worth inviting to. And actually, one of the things we learned from that is often we ran an event twice. The first time almost for the Christians to see it was okay, and the second time for them to invite their friends. And most of our events, we had majority people who were outside church coming to them. But that meant then we said, okay, if that's what we're asking people, and everyone said, yeah, we can do that, that seems reasonable to expect that of us, then what are the other things we need to put in place as a church and to pick people's specific gifts to do that? So one thing, for instance, was the whole area of discipleship. How do we help people to explore faith more and begin to grow in the faith? And we did things centrally around that. Some of the social injustice things, we did some central stuff. So it's those kind of things, thinking, well, what is it we're asking individuals to do? What do we need to put into place? But all the time asking, how are we equipping people to do that? We can't just, as leaders, sit back and say, oh, they're not doing it, if we're not equipping them to do it. Fourthly is example. I'd say as leaders, we have to set the example, even if this isn't our natural gifting. And in some ways, that helps, I think, if it isn't, and we're sharing not just our successes, but our failures. So when I'm asking people to invite people to something at the church, I need to be involved in doing that as well. And it's absolutely fine if I express from the front how I try to invite someone and they're not coming, because that just encourages people. The key thing is the inviting. The rest of it is up to God. But we need to be providing from the front and illustrations and examples of us involved in this, conversations that we've had, all that kind of thing. And I think for us who as leaders, the key thing around that is time. Because it's always true that we either live by our priorities or we live by our pressures. And the question is, what is the loudest voice for us? I've just been doing some work with a church in London with their leadership team. And one of my suggestions, as I've made to a number of churches, is that the leaders should spend at least one day a week of their work time outside the church. So it might be working in a coffee shop or volunteering somewhere. It could be a whole host of things. And I think actually that transforms things when leaders are spending a paid part of their work outside the church, meeting with people outside the church, and not having that place of kind of, I am the minister, or I am the leader, or I'm the chair of the church council, or whatever it might be, but actually I'm just here as whatever it might be in that community role, or in that place, or in that workplace. How might that transform things if a day a week we were working outside our church experience? How might that change our attitudes and our abilities? The danger is, I think, as leaders, the pull of church is always powerful, isn't it? It's always sucking us in. There's always more to do. One of the things about church life is it never finishes. So unless we live by our priorities, we will live by our pressures. And then the last E, I think, is this expectancy. It's back to that, do you believe this? That God is at work and we are his people. And I think this is where it comes to those spiritual things of prayer, of discerning where the Spirit's at, of trusting God that as we work, he will be at work. It's a really good question to ask of ourselves and our church. How expectant are we that God will work through us? How expectant are we that we will see our lives, but also the lives of others transformed? And again, that is always a spiritual work. It's that whole thing that Rowan Williams was saying. Are we saying, well, there used to be, this change, and we remember it once? Or are we saying, actually there is this expectancy that that encounter is happening all the time, for us and for others in our community. And how important the prayer is and the work of the Spirit as we listen to what God is doing is that. So I think that it's really important that we understand, whatever our gifting, actually we have really important roles in this, in envisioning people, in encouraging them and equipping them, in providing an example, and of being expectant. So what I'd like you to do is just talk about your own role now, not your church, and to talk in terms of this. What's your biggest opportunity around all this, and what's your biggest challenge? And I'm just going to give you, again, about 5 or 6 minutes to kind of briefly talk about this. But for you personally, as a leader in whatever you're doing, wherever you are, and I know some of you in paid roles, others are not, but what's your biggest personal opportunity around these 6 E's we were talking about, and what's your biggest challenge? Okay, and then I'll call you back in about 6 or 7 minutes. For those of you who have remained to the end, you get the chance to talk about how this might impact the whole of Synod. Which we're going to do in a minute. But out of that, I've proposed 12 tentative suggestions. And I say those tentatively because I do love you, and being an extrovert, I love being loved. So I offer these. I offer these as someone who doesn't know, which can make you more prophetic, but can make you stupid as well, because you say things that you think this isn't possible, or you don't understand everything. But actually, sometimes that can be prophetic in itself. And none of these are that people have whispered in my ear, Dave, you need to say this. This is just my observations from my visits, particularly from this last time. So I offer them in love, but I also offer them saying they might be way off the beam. But I just had this sense of wanting to say a few things to you. And then I'm going to give you a chance to talk about these things and others. And on your table are some pieces of paper. And what we'd like you to do is, when you have the discussion, capture your discussions so that they can be fed back, because I don't want those discussions to be wasted. It would be really good for that stuff to come back. So, in all that humbleness, here are my suggestions. The first, and you'll be doing a lot of this anyway, but make evangelism a top priority at all levels. They say, don't they, that culture eats vision for breakfast. So you can have a fantastic vision about what you want to do, but if the culture isn't like that, it will never happen. So I think, and I imagine that people are already thinking about this, but how do we make evangelism a top priority at all levels? Secondly, as a denomination, how do we both pray and plan and then pray? What might be ways that we can intentionally show that we are praying about this as a denomination? What might be some ways, rather than just saying, oh, it'd be really good for churches to pray about this, how might we actually do that in a way that brings us together across our divides and unites us in praying for God's mission and for people who are outside the church? Thirdly, I think, and again, you may well be doing this because I'm just saying this from my own perspective, it's really important that you discover, treasure, train, and equip and network your best evangelists, ordained and lay. Who are those people? So it might need a bit of discovery out there in your churches, because often they hang around on the margins, not in the center of church life. How are you going to treasure them, train them, equip them, bring them together? Even on this trip, just meeting people, I've met already 3 brilliant people who I would just say, release them and let them do what God's called them to do. Fourthly, around those people, the thing I want to say to you most is invest in people, not buildings. I'd find those people, release them, because one of the problems is the structure says, and this is the same in the UK, they've got to work this way, but actually release them around their giftings And fifthly, church plant fresh expression around those people. They're the heart of it. The buildings may come later as things begin to develop, but don't start with the buildings, start with the people. Who are the kind of these 10, 15, there may not be loads of them, who you can invest in? I worked out that if you did that for 5 years around those people, you know, you're talking about way less than any one building. And the effectiveness, I think, will be immense as you begin to see who those people are, invest in them, and church plant around them. And as I said, it may well be that buildings begin to come from that, but don't start with the building, start with the people. Obviously, and again, you're probably working on this, but just the importance, again, of developing an integrated policy for fresh expressions and church planting, including things like people, budget, training, and resources. This is one of my big beefs with the Church of England. It needs to be all these areas. You can't just do it at the margins. It has to involve people, money, training, resources. At least all these things are coming together. It'll just stay as something on the margins. Number 7, Presbytery mission staff to be involved in fresh expressions or church planting at least one day a week. I think they are brilliant people and a great resource who could work with those. So I'm not suggesting that those people do it on their own. I would suggest you put them with people already doing it to be a support and an encouragement to those. But it will also help them to sharpen their consultancy practice because they're out there doing it as well. Eighthly, know what's happening and share good practices. Maybe through a website, through other things. What is happening? What is in all the different parts of the church that's really good? And how might you share those good practices? I think one of the great things with the Fresh Expression Network has been the story page with Fresh Expressions, where there are now about 400 stories where you can find out what's going on. Again, not to copy it, but to be encouraged and to have your imagination open to what might happen. Number 9, this might be a bit controversial, but explore the link between evangelism, fresh expressions, and your agency. I know there's been some discussion about your agencies and how they relate to the church part of the life, but it seems to me that those agencies are a real gift. I mean, we don't have that kind of thing in the United Kingdom. But how could those places be places where you might be church planting? In care homes, in schools, in hospitals. How can you bring those two things together? Where they're still doing that important social service work they're doing, you know, and that needs to continue, of course. But how might those become real hubs for church? And what might that look like, and what might that mean? And from that, and that's linked to that, move from chaplaincy to church. So move from the sense of, I'm here to look after these people, to how might we begin to do church here? Not in the same sense that we do it on a Sunday necessarily, but thinking about those 4 sets of relationships. What might it mean for church to begin to grow in these places, to move from that mindset of just chaplaincy to church? 11th, how as a denomination in South Australia can we train all of our people to share their story? That's one of the things I hear a lot as I go around. People saying people don't know how to articulate their own story. How can we intentionally provide resources, write resources, make resources that will enable people to share their story with those around them in the community? And the last one I'd throw in is train more people through mission-shaped ministry. For us, in the bit of England I live, that's been so key for developing particularly lay leadership. We've now put about 200 people, mostly lay, through that. And they are, many of those, key leaders now in developing new expressions of church. Really, really important. The last thing I want to say to you is, do what you can, not what you can't. So often we think about, we'd love it if we could do this, actually, I think it's better to start with what have we got and how is God calling us to use that and develop that. As I said, this may all be rubbish that I'm saying, but what I'd like you to do is just on your tables is really talk about what's your reaction to that, what's good, what won't work, but above all, what could be added. That's the conversation. What would you like to be saying together as Synod about these things in terms of structures and practices and attitudes that can be fed back in to your working, so that all that gets shared in the next 20 minutes isn't lost, but you are part of this conversation, hopefully stimulated by what you've heard today. So that would be my main cry to you, that to write down and write up the things that you would want to say as Synod about these matters of how you make evangelism a priority in South Australia for the Uniting Church. Does that make sense? Yep. Okay, if you haven't got any paper, be like school now, put up your hand, but they should be on your table, and I will give you a good 20 minutes to do that. The good news is we finished early. And so I just want to say thank you again. I do love being amongst you. I love your enthusiasm and your generosity and your faith and your hope. And I think my last encouragement is to be encouraged and to take risks and to step out and to trust that God is there to catch you and to be with you and to work in and through you. So we're going to carry on in a moment in a very appropriate way as we come to communion. We're reminded again of what is at the heart of our faith, and that the heart of our faith is not just a story, but it is an encounter that we partake in that transforms us so that we might transform others. So I'm going to hand over, I think now, yep. And but just to say thank you for your energy today and the work you've put into that. It makes it so much easier for me, and I really appreciate that. So thank you.